There we go. This webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting the webinar to our website as well as our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to watch a recording of this, and we will also make the slides available. They will be posted as well. So don't feel like you need to take notes and the screenshots and all that stuff, because we will share this material when the webinar is concluded for all to have. And it is a lot of material. So hopefully we have time to get through everything. But welcome. What a pleasure to have so many folks join us. Must be something going on here in Indiana related to the data centers. A lot of activity, and we're here to talk about a lot of what's happening. Just some quick introductions. I am Kerwin Olson. I'm the executive director here at Citizens Action Coalition. I am joined tonight by my colleagues Kelly Hamman, our Director of Development, and Ben Inskeep, our Program Director. Unfortunately, Bryce, our lead organizer at the CAC, who has been out there on the ground, as so many of you know, hitting just about every county in the state over the last couple of months. He is not feeling great and got a little virus or something, so he will not be joining us this evening, but you'll have myself and Kelly and Ben here with you tonight. Just quickly, a little bit about CAC. We're Citizens Action Coalition of Indiana, headquartered here in Indianapolis, Indiana's oldest, largest consumer and environmental advocacy organization, founded back in 1974, 51 years and going strong. And in our time, we've helped, save Hoosiers billions of dollars in excess utility charges. We advocate on a lot of issues, primarily energy policy, utility reform, utility rates, and we dabble as well in healthcare issues, pollution prevention, and family farms. And we're out there in communities, organizing at the grassroots level, down there at the State House, working on your behalf. And also the regulatory advocacy that we do, not only at the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, but also throughout the communities when we do some town halls and other events around relevant and important cases. So just a quick agenda. We're going to talk about data centers in Indiana and all the stuff that's happening in our state relative to data centers, the impact that data centers have on our pocketbooks, on our communities, on our public well-being and natural resources and environment. Some of the things about responding to a data center proposal in your community, in your state, and then we'll follow it up with a Q&A. And I would note that the chat is disabled, and I don't believe we can take questions verbally. So please type your questions into the Q&A, and we'll respond, at the end after the presentation. So data centers in Indiana, just quickly. I don't know that we need to talk about this at any great length, but what's a data center? Basically a big warehouse, a big box that houses a bunch of computer systems, services, servers, storage devices, network equipment that stores data, processes data, manages that data. We're now seeing large hyperscaler data center, even data center campuses composed of multiple large buildings on hundreds and hundreds of acres. What's driving this? Well, our new friend, artificial intelligence, AI, is driving this purported alleged need for this data center build out. And as we know, what really is pushing significant public interest in this, of course, is the power intensity of these data centers that can use upwards of 2,300 megawatts at a single facility, which Ben will talk about in more detail when we turn it over to Ben. Why are they locating in Indiana? Why is Indiana one of the ground zero states, if you will, for this data center development? Subsidies. 2019, we passed a significant bill that provides a 50-year state sales tax exemption to data centers, generous local property tax abatements, and of course, an extremely favorable legislative and regulatory environment here in Indiana. Infrastructure, we're the crossroads of America. Our highways, interstates, the intersection of two of the major grids in the state of Indiana with MISO and PJM. We've got pipelines, communication networks, and again, highways, railways, lots of transportation, low-cost land, low-cost labor. Indiana, as you know, open for business. Incredibly friendly business tax environment, investment environment for business. Proximity, close to a lot of populations, centers, Louisville, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, etc. And, here in Indiana, natural disaster risk is fairly low relative to earthquakes, forest fires, hurricanes, and things like that. So Indiana is an attractive place for these data centers, not to mention, probably should have included water on here. Right here in the Great Lakes region, lots of fresh water. So we got what they need, if you will. Just quickly before we turn it over to Ben to do a deep dive on data centers, 2025 legislative session was a good session for big tech and for data centers. Key takeaways from 2025. We've already got, we've got information on our website about the 2025 session of the Indiana General Assembly. But we passed favorable legislation allowing utilities to raise electric bills more quickly, get approval more quickly, for fast-tracking new resources and facilities necessary to serve these data centers. We reduced local control over the siting of energy, primarily nuclear and fossil fuel resources, but boy, they had some big wins. Most notably, House Enrolled Act 1007, which included, first of all, a 20% tax credit for SMR manufacturing to be located in the state of Indiana. And as I mentioned, it creates a really fast-track approval process before the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission related to building or acquiring or procuring new power plants to serve data centers and other large load customers. Really reduced regulatory oversight to the detriment of consumers, we believe. Additionally, House Enrolled Act 1007 also made it much more difficult for utilities to close large power plants, most notably coal-fired power plants, which, as we know, many data centers have an interest in connecting to some of the outdated coal plants here in Indiana, and 1007 did them a favor by making it a little more difficult should a utility or another electricity supplier want to retire a coal-fired power plant. And also thought it worth a mention for what a banner year small modular reactors, SMRs, had at the General Assembly. As we know, big tech has an interest in nuclear power, specifically SMRs, small modular reactors, 3 significant pieces of legislation that provides a really favorable regulatory treatment for small modular reactors. We had Senate Enrolled Act 423, which created the SMR partnership pilot program, if you will, fast-tracked approval process, allows utilities to partner with large customers like quote unquote data centers and big tech to site potentially SMRs at their facilities or purchase electricity, forces customers to pay for SMR pre-construction project development costs. A couple of years ago, they got a tracker, construction work in progress, to force ratepayers to finance the construction of nuclear power plants. That wasn't good enough. So this year they got them, forced ratepayers to pay for pre-construction activity of SMRs, even if those SMRs never come online. Senate Enrolled Act 424 allows utilities to do pretty much what Senate Bill 423 does, but without a partnership, if you will, just the utility itself wanting to build an SMR to serve a load. They can jack up your bill to pay for pre-construction activities. And then we had Senate Enrolled Act 424, otherwise known as Energy Production Zone, which was defined as a location where a current power plant facility of 80 megawatts or later or greater was located, either operating or retired, or an underground or abandoned mine. That was defined as an energy production zone. And if a utility wants to site an SMR or another facility on an energy production zone, guess what? All local control over any permitting or zoning was removed in energy production zones, and the utilities and the providers can pretty much do as they see fit, and the locals have absolutely no control over the siting of those dangerous and risky facilities. So banner year for the utilities, for the SMR nuclear industry, and for big tech at the General Assembly related to serving the electric needs of big data. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our program director, Ben Inskeep, who has done a tremendous amount of work diving into all the details and everything you need to know about data centers. And with that, please take it away, Ben.
Thank you, Kerwin, and good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting us into your homes tonight to talk to you tonight about data centers. Let's turn now to some of the proposals we're seeing here in Indiana. Right now, we're currently tracking at Citizens Action Coalition roughly 40 different data center proposals across the state of Indiana. These include proposals that have already started construction and operating, 5 different places. And it also includes a number of proposals that have already been withdrawn, thanks in part to successful pushback at the local level. We see different types of companies proposing these, including big tech companies like Amazon, Meta, Google, and Microsoft, but also other entities such as developers and real estate firms, as well as co-location data center companies. These are companies that build data centers and then lease out portions of the data center to different companies. Next slide. Turning to specifically the big tech proposals for data centers in Indiana, there's at least 7 of these facilities that the large big tech companies are currently planning. And indeed, several of them are already under construction, including the Google facility in Fort Wayne and the Amazon facility in New Carlisle. We've tracked down a lot of information about their power consumption. This information is not readily available. It takes a lot of digging to find public sources of this. Altogether, we're looking at nearly 7,000 megawatts across these 6 facilities where we've identified a power consumption amount. And then the Google facility in Indianapolis still is unknown to us, the specific power demand. Now, I want to contextualize these big tech companies that are coming to the state of Indiana because this is a pretty significant development in terms of how big these companies are. We're talking about some of the most successful, financially speaking, companies in the history of human civilization, if you will. These are some of the largest companies on Earth today. For context, I've shown here the market cap of these companies and compared it to Eli Lilly, which is the largest publicly traded company headquartered in Indiana, as well as to the 5 parent companies of our investor-owned electric utilities. And you can see how much smaller they are relative to just one of these big tech companies. And that really illustrates not only do these entities have a lot of wealth, but they also have a lot of political power. Let's look at a couple specific examples so we can kind of get a sense of what's being proposed. Let's first look at the Amazon facility in New Carlisle. Now, we've been referring to this as a data center, but in reality, it's at least 3 data center campuses that are going to span 1,200 acres in northern Indiana. The purpose of these facilities is to power the Anthropic AI model that AI has invested at least $8 billion into so far. The specific portions that you're seeing on the right-hand side in the image, the purple outline, the red outline, and the green outline are the 3 specific parcels of land there where Amazon is developing data center buildings. It has already constructed 7 different building shells, and it's planning to construct at least 30 by the time it's fully completed. Notably, the green portion, or the portion outlined in green at the bottom, includes a regulated wetland that Amazon would like to essentially destroy so they can put a data center on top of it. And I'll also note that this facility stands out for its size. It's the largest of our data center proposals at over 2,000 megawatts once it's completed. And it has 1,300 megawatts of backup diesel generators that are going to be sited at these facilities, as well as over 3 million gallons of diesel storage on site. Let's look now at the Meta facility coming to LEAP. So LEAP is a manufacturing and innovation district, if you will, where they're trying to attract economic development about 30 miles northwest of Indianapolis in Lebanon, Indiana. Meta has announced that it's going to be one of the tenants of this site, and it's going to be building a data center on 1,200 acres of land there. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner an overall map of this LEAP district, and you can see where Meta's facilities are relative to Eli Lilly and other infrastructure there. On the right-hand side, you see zoomed in on the Meta parcel specifically, which is outlined in red. The yellow rectangular objects you see are where they're going to be putting different data center buildings, at least 12 buildings, and construction could begin as early as next month on this facility. It has already secured the local rezoning necessary for it. Notably, this site is going to be tapping into the city of Indianapolis's water resources in order to provide the water it needs. That includes the Eagle Creek Reservoir as well as the White River that the city of Indianapolis will be sending essentially to Lebanon using a state revolving loan fund. It's also notable that the transmission projects from this data center are not only going to impose costs on the utility serving Meta, but also on neighboring utilities. Like if you're a customer of Duke Energy or AES Indiana, your bills could be going up to pay for transmission projects that are necessary to preserve grid reliability once this data center comes online. Let's turn now to the impacts of data centers. Now you can see from this slide, there are many, many different impacts on data centers, and we have information on all of them in our slide deck here. But we're probably not going to have time today in our webinar to go through all of these in great detail. So please feel free to peruse our slides afterwards to get more information if there's anything I don't have time to cover in sufficient detail today. But with that, let's turn to the energy impacts of data centers, because this is garnering a lot of attention for good reason. AI data centers like those coming to Indiana can use on the order of 10 times more power than the next largest electric utility customer on the grid. So that's what this figure here is showing. On the far right, you see the Amazon data center campus coming to New Carlisle, and you can see their ultimate peak load could be as high as 2,200 megawatts. And to the left of that, you see different industrial facilities also located in Indiana that are very large, very heavy, very significant energy users. But by comparison, they look relatively small. For example, you see the Cleveland Cliffs Burns Harbor steel mill on there using roughly 1/10 the amount of power that the Amazon data center campus would use, even though that steel mill is probably one of the largest electricity consumers in the state of Indiana. I just wanted to highlight or remind folks briefly that artificial intelligence, as Kerwin noted earlier, is the driving force behind this extremely high power consumption. It's not because we're running out of capacity for the internet. It's not because we need this amount of power in order to operate our Netflix or Spotify. Data center companies often will sell their data center to community and suggest that you're a hypocrite if you're opposing the data center because don't you like the internet and the wonderful things that you can do with this modern technology. But at the end of the day, that's not really what's the driving force behind a lot of these impacts. It really comes down to artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. And this was going to have nationwide ramifications. This is not only a trend we're observing in Indiana. So as a percentage of our entire electricity consumption across America, data centers were responsible for roughly 2% of that overall electricity usage as of 2017. Fast forward 6 years to 2023, and that impact had already doubled, or more than doubled, nearly 4.5% of our electricity consumption in this country. Looking forward, we see the tremendous growth of data centers that could significantly increase that even further, up to as high as 12% by 2028. And these are figures according to the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Next slide, please. In Indiana, we have already, these data centers have already executed binding agreements to come to the state and take services from utilities. So this is not just speculative load. It's not speculative in the fact that these facilities have already inked deals for on the order of more than 3,000 megawatts, probably actually today closer to 4,000 megawatts of executed agreements with utilities. And so to put this in a context, we have run a scenario looking at if some additional data centers also come online in addition to what has already been completely confirmed through these contracts, such as if some of these other 40 data centers come online, to see what kind of impact that would have. So we looked at a scenario with nearly 8,000 megawatts total coming online and what that would do to our electricity consumption in the state. So let's take a look. This graph here is showing our electricity consumption, both historic and forecasting out into the future up to 2032. And the gray part of the chart shows you the residential, commercial, and industrial electricity consumption over time. And you see that that amount is relatively stable. There's been some fluctuations up and down from year to year, as you would expect, but it's been relatively stable. Now fast forward to the future, adding the data center load to that, you can see in red just how sharply our electricity consumption in the state is going to increase with these new data centers. So that's going to pose some very significant challenges. Let's dive into some of those challenges. First of all, there's a lot of concern about the cost impacts to utility customers in Indiana from these data centers. The figure here on this chart shows how our electric utility bills have increased over time for our 5 investor-owned electric utilities. And in fact, just this past year, we noticed that the average electric utility bill increase was $28 per month across those 5 investor-owned utilities. That's the largest year-over-year increase we've seen in at least 2 decades, going back at least two decades, seeing how these bills have changed. So we're already experiencing a utility affordability crisis that's getting worse in the state of Indiana. And now we have data centers coming in that could really exacerbate these challenges for several reasons. First, utilities, as Kerwin noted, utilities are allowed to increase ratepayer bills to pay for things like power plant upgrades that are going to be serving these data centers, such as the legislation that was enacted this past session related to small modular nuclear reactors. There's also a trend we're observing in the electric utility industry where the cost of everything is getting much more expensive as a result of this very strong demand from data centers happening in a very short amount of time. So for example, the cost of building a new natural gas-fired power plant has more than doubled in less than 3 years. So very significant, very sharp increases in the cost of building new infrastructure to serve these data centers. And if the cost of this new infrastructure is blended in with the cost of the infrastructure we're already paying for, it could result in the average cost increasing for all customers. Finally, I would note that large electric users often get sweetheart deals with the utility that give them favorable rates and terms. So that's also a concern with data centers, especially big tech companies that wield a lot of wealth and power, not just figuratively, but also when it comes to the laws, to the regulations, to the deals that get enacted in our state. All right, let's move along to talking about the next topic of, first, just to give a few examples here. I'm not going to go through all of this, but just to highlight an example or two of how costs are already increasing. We could look at the Meta data center coming to Jeffersonville in Southeast Indiana. There's a very clear example of a cost shift occurring where $113 million in transmission upgrades were identified as necessary in order to connect that data center and other economic development to the grid and still provide reliable power. However, that cost upgrade was not paid for by Meta, but rather it was designated as a targeted economic development project. And that enabled Duke Energy to, instead of making Meta pay for those costs, to instead charge other ratepayers to spread those costs out and socialize those costs onto all Duke Energy ratepayers. So if you're Duke Energy ratepayer, part of your bill is going towards this infrastructure that is specifically to serve the Meta data center. Let's move on to the next slide, please. With this great increase in electricity consumption comes the threat that our progress towards addressing the climate crisis could either be slowed down or even reversed. And that's what we're seeing so far. First, we have coal plant retirements that are now being threatened. Many of our utilities were planning to retire all of their coal plants by the end of the decade. And that's now come into question and is being jeopardized as a result of AI data centers and the enormous power demands they use. We also see that utilities, in addition to potentially delaying retirements of coal plants, are now planning massive expansions of new fossil fuel infrastructure that could last another 40 plus years. Things like new natural gas-fired power plants. And that's what's shown here on this chart. I&M and NIPSCO are 2 of our investor-owned electric utilities, and they're the ones that have the largest amount of data center load growth at this point in time. And so you can see from this chart, the way that they're planning on meeting this new electricity need is primarily through new fossil fuel, new natural gas-fired power plants. Well, let's move on to the next slide, please. Focusing in on one of those utilities in particular, NIPSCO up in Northwest Indiana, this chart depicts their carbon dioxide emissions over time. And they've been declining over time as they've been retiring coal-fired power plants and building cleaner generation. And they were still planning on that reducing further into the future under their scenario without any data centers coming to their service territory. However, that's changed. Now, lots of data centers are planning on locating in Northwest Indiana. And NIPSCO is reversing course. It's planning actually to build a large amount of natural gas, and that's going to result in, instead of their emissions declining over time, increasing significantly over time, a 30% increase by 2035, potentially, if this data center load materializes. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into depth on the grid reliability and stability challenges with data centers, but I'll note that these are very real and significant, and that we don't currently have the standards in place to address these new power users that can significantly alter their power consumption in a very short amount of time. Very quickly, just the top left image is a data center's, how much power they're using at any given time. And it went from a very high level of 450 megawatts, dropped down to only 40 megawatts, about a tenth of that, in a period of only 36 seconds. So that's one example of the challenges that then a utility has to be able to respond to meet these oscillations. These are not loads that are perfectly steady over time, but they can in fact vary significantly second by second, hour by hour, and those changes can be very difficult for a utility to respond to because of the size of these electricity consumers. Next slide, please. Water is a critical issue when it comes to data centers because they utilize enormous amounts of water for cooling purposes. Just like your computer gets hot when you use it and you're running a lot of applications, the servers in a data center get really hot when they're operating, and you need cooling in order to protect those investments and make sure they continue to function as planned. So a data center can use as much as millions of gallons of water per day for that purpose. But it's not just the water they use on site that matters. That's what we often think of first. But the indirect water consumption can actually be a much more significant impact. What I mean by indirect water consumption is all that water that's being used by the power plants to generate that massive amount of electricity to serve the data center. Things like, or power plants like coal, gas, and nuclear all use enormous amounts of water for cooling purposes. And so there's a water use impact that goes along with the enormous energy consumption of these facilities. For example, a large coal or gas plant could consume on the order of 10 million gallons of water per day. Next slide, please. This just provides some additional details that I'm not going to go into now, but we were able to dig up some specific figures from filings with the Indiana Department of Environmental Management for some specific data centers. So this provides some of those details if you're interested in getting that information. But overall, it's very difficult to find actual water consumption figures or planned water consumption figures related to these data centers. And it goes to the issue of transparency, which we'll touch on shortly. Subsidies are a major concern with data centers. They're potentially the most subsidized industry in state history. It's hard to state unequivocally the exact amount, because our state is not studying this. There's no transparency in the amount of subsidies that are going to data centers on an annual basis. So we don't have detailed knowledge currently of what the amount of subsidies are. But as Kerwin mentioned, they do have up to a 50-year sales tax exemption that's extremely lucrative for a data center that uses an enormous amount of electricity. You and I, as residential consumers, are going to be paying a 7% sales tax on our electric utility bill, but that 7% sales tax is not going to be applied to these data center bills. And their bills can be quite significant. We're talking on the order of nearly $500 million a year for a data center sized 1,000 megawatts. And that's in the I&M service territory. So that's a specific figure that was provided by a utility. It's not CAC math. This is coming straight from the utility. When we apply that 7% sales tax to that figure, we see that a data center of this size coming to Indiana would receive a $34.5 million per year subsidy on their electric utility bill by virtue of not having to pay that sales tax. And over 50 years, that can add up to over $1.7 billion. And again, this is only on their electric utility bill. This doesn't include the other component of the sales tax exemption, That is the fact that they're not paying sales tax on all the equipment that goes into the data center, including backup diesel generators, including other facility infrastructure. Don't have time to get into it at the moment, but there's also other subsidies we need to be cognizant of when it comes to the data centers coming here, things like state tax credits, as well as at the local level, local units of government can pass property tax abatements. Those can add up to on the order of potentially hundreds of millions to billions of dollars for a data center that gets one of these abatements. Next slide, please. And what are we doing this for? At the end of the day, these facilities provide very few jobs. We're talking in the order of dozens to potentially hundreds of jobs for a very large data center. So to compare that to other industries, we obtained data from Indiana Michigan Power on the other types of economic development, how many jobs per unit of energy that economic development brings. And according to their analysis, they found that there were 41 jobs from other types of economic development per 1 megawatt of power consumption. Compare that to data centers, they're providing fewer than 1 job per megawatt. So in other words, other types of economic development we can attract to our communities is going to provide on the order of more than 100 times more jobs per unit of power going to the facility. Next slide, please. And it's also worth noting, economic development is often touted as the reason to promote data centers. But what we're actually seeing is the fact that these data centers use so much power, they use up the available infrastructure, and it means any other types of economic development that want to locate in the community thereafter could have a very long waiting line, very long period of time, and some expensive upgrades to the utility grid in order to accommodate that load. So what you're doing by inviting a data center to your community could very well be preventing other industry that you might have a preference for from being able to locate in your community easily in the future. A big issue with data centers is the lack of transparency and accountability that come with these facilities in particular. What we're noticing is the highly secretive nature and how they're engaging with local community members and elected officials. So for example, they typically will force local elected officials to execute a non-disclosure agreement that prevents the elected official from discussing the details of the proposed data center. They also are going to be using shell companies and project code names that are going to be able to hide the identity of the company, as well as potentially even hide the fact that it's a data center that is being proposed, to keep that out of to keep the community in the dark about who is doing the project and what the nature of the project, the fact that it's a data center. So for example, it can be difficult when you're searching for a permit at the Indiana Department of Environmental Management to find the permit for the data center, because it might be using a LLC shell company name to get that permit under. It's also, we've also observed a pattern of a lack of advanced notice in many of these communities where there's a data center proposal. The community members that are impacted don't find out about it until maybe only a couple weeks prior to the rezoning meeting at the local unit of government that the data center needs in order to build the facility. So only a couple week notice is insufficient time to gather information, to get organized, to vet a project and make sure as a community member, that you support it, or if you have concerns about it, that you can have those concerns addressed. So at the end of the day, the data centers are providing very limited to no disclosure about very key information about the impacts of their facilities. We're talking very little information, if any, about their planned energy consumption or water consumption, the nature and extent of the subsidies they're getting at the state and local unit of government, and all the costs that are going into the utility providing electricity to the data center, and any assurances or protections to make sure that other customers aren't going to be footing the bill for some of these infrastructure upgrades. Next slide, please. Land use impacts are also quite significant with the data centers. As we mentioned, these facilities are sited on potentially hundreds to more than 1,000 acres, and that can be on prime agricultural farmland. It can be forested land. It could be areas, protected wetlands. So the potential impacts of that land use could be pretty significant. The building sizes are quite large and can be quite tall as well. One data center composed of potentially a dozen or more buildings, each sized 200,000 square feet or larger. And we're seeing buildings that are, potentially 60, 70 feet tall in nature, so that they don't actually, they don't necessarily fit the characteristics of the community and align with the vision of that land use. It's also important to note that with data centers come backup diesel generators, which I'll touch on more shortly. But those can also have significant impacts as well. So let's look at some of those other impacts. Real briefly, I'll mention that Amazon has already notified the Indiana Department of Environmental Management that there has been a diesel fuel leak on site. So some of these concerns are not really speculative, but we're actually already observing it with what's occurring today. With diesel generators, the purpose of these is the data centers want to maintain their online status 24/7, 365. And so they have diesel generators on site as a backup. So if the transmission system were to go down, for example, they would have a source of power to continue to operate. But these facilities, because they're so large and have so much power demand, they need lots of diesel generators to back up their load. That can result in millions of gallons of diesel being stored on site. These are not just rare nuisances, but in fact, diesel generators typically are going to be tested on a weekly or monthly basis. So neighbors to this facility could have to endure those impacts on a regular basis, including the noise of them. Let's move along now to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Let's skip over construction for now. I know we're limited in time tonight, so I want to hit a couple more things real quick. So very briefly, the visual and aesthetic impacts and potentially the impacts on property values is also real. You can see that the two photographs on the right-hand side of the slide show an Amazon data center in Virginia that we visited. You can see it's located right next door to a playground and a sports complex, as well as residential dwellings. So this facility is very noisy. You could hear it from the chain link fence where I took that photo. It's a very loud industrial hum that's going 24/7. That imposes a pretty significant sound impact on the community. But also the size of these buildings, you can see, they're quite large. They're not hidden. They're visually obtrusive, if you will. The bottom left photo is actually of a cemetery we visited as well. The cemetery is now being surrounded on all four sides by data centers there. And you can see the backdrop of that photo, a data center being constructed. So that also, would, diminish the experience, visiting that if you're there and you're hearing that construction and having that experience. Next slide, please. Finally, noise can be quite significant at these sites. This is the metadata center I was talking about earlier at the Lebanon location. And they did a noise study and found, I believe, up to 63 decibels at the property line of that data center. So that's quite a loud noise to be subjected to continuously, particularly for folks that might be living there. And so that's a very significant impact of these facilities. The cooling systems that they use can be extraordinarily loud, and the servers themselves can be very loud. So that is a significant impact, and there's not necessarily good enforceability if there is noise issue. It can be difficult to get a facility like this to reduce their noise. All right, let's now turn to the response to data centers, how utilities in Indiana are responding. So there's several different models that our utilities are going down. These models are how they're going to be serving the data centers in terms of the rates that they pay, in terms of how the power plants that are going to be constructed or acquired to serve them are going to be allocated to the data center and preventing impacts from other customers potentially. So the Indiana-Michigan power model is a model that actually resulted from a settlement agreement between Indiana and Michigan Power, the Citizens Action Coalition, and data center interveners in that case. Under that proposal, or excuse me, under that system, data centers are going to be treated just like other large industrial customers, served under a transparent published tariff rate under clearly transparent terms. There's additional consumer protections that were added for these specific large customers that are more protective than the terms and conditions that apply to other industrial customers, such as a long-term contract. In other words, making sure the data center is there to stick around and pay back the utility for the infrastructure, as opposed to just come for a couple years and then leave town and leave us with the bill. In contrast, you have the NIPSCO model, where NIPSCO, instead of treating the data centers just like they would an industrial customer and serving them under a tariffed rate and acquiring the power to serve those data centers, it's creating a separate company called a generation company, or GenCo for short. This separate company is going to own the power plants specifically to serve these very large load customers, these data centers. NIPSCO will then enter into a contract with that generation company, that GenCo, to buy power from it to serve those data centers. And in turn, those data centers are going to have to sign a contract with NIPSCO to get power from them, from that GenCo. Now, the benefit of this arrangement is that it would help, at least in theory, isolate existing ratepayers from the potential risk of stranded costs from these power plants, or potentially even cost of the power plants being very expensive and raising rates. However, there's not a lot of transparency in this arrangement. There's not the adequate consumer protections that have been spelled out. So the Citizens Action Coalition and other interveners in that case are currently opposing this model due to the lack of specificity and consumer protections that have been articulated so far. Finally, you have the Duke special, the Duke model, which is a special contract situation. In other words, Duke is executing a special contract with Meta, where instead of Duke going out and buying power plants or building power plants to serve Meta, it's allowing Meta to go out to the power market to get the power plants and the electricity it needs from the wholesale power market. So three very different models that are already making their way in Indiana, with several other utilities that don't have any clear model in place, but are also examining data centers. So these are all very important issues for consumers in terms of protecting them from potential cost shifts. And it's something the Citizens Action Coalition has been extremely engaged in and will continue going forward. But for now, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Kelly, who's going to talk more about how communities are responding to these data center proposals. So Kelly, why don't you take it away, please?
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. There's a big range, right, in data center proposals across Indiana, and there's also a big range in then how communities are responding to those proposals. I do want to echo a sentiment Ben made earlier where, sometimes the use of NDAs and lack of advance notice means that communities kind of go through a frantic moment of trying to gather information because they might feel caught off guard when they don't have much time to respond to a data center proposal before their local elected officials vote on it. So that's common ground, folks trying to figure out what's going on with the data center and how it will impact their neighborhood, but also their broader community and state. We've also seen different communities across Indiana organize opposition, getting yard signs, getting T-shirts. I can think of the folks up in Wheeler, their corporate or country, not corporate, getting different media and billboards, and of course, contacting and advocating their elected officials to act in a certain way. Communities can also engage to update different various local zoning codes or unified development ordinances. We've seen some communities come together and demand and negotiate different commitments from the data center developer to insert certain protections for their community. We also see communities come together to consider different proposals. And of course, lawyering up is another route that a few groups have taken to respond to data centers coming to their locality. A couple of pieces of advice to keep in mind if a data center is coming to your community. The earlier that you can engage in the rezoning process and the tax abatement process, the better. Kerwin mentioned that, these data centers are getting, of course, state tax relief, but they can also get local tax relief as well. So the earlier that you can be aware of the process and what's going on, and of course, engage your local elected officials, the better. Organizing is key, so that as many people as possible in your community are aware of the proposal and what you can do about it. Spreading the word through social media and, of course, engaging with different community groups is a wonderful way to kind of spread the word so that more folks are aware of what's going on. We know that there's not a ton of transparency with a lot of these proposals, so the more you can encourage elected officials to share information with you and the developers to share information with you, kind of the more fuel that you have to get more folks involved and engaged. Um, Delay and obstruct or request delays is another strategy so that you have more time to digest everything. But it is important to stay focused, especially when there's kind of an expedited timeline to react. You're focusing on the data center. There's a lot of information to consume, but take things one step at a time and follow the process as best as you can. Just a few pieces of advice there. Local elected officials will sometimes, have informational sessions, or the developer will hold an informational session. And the more you can bring your community together and have a coherent message for the developer and your local elected official, the more effective you are in pressuring for an outcome that your community desires. Because we have seen communities really come together and say, we don't want this data center in our community. We've got a list of 6 proposals that have been shut down because of public pressure all across the state. And we have 3 more proposals that are being challenged in court. So lawyers can help you navigate different legal avenues. And if you have the ability to engage lawyers, that can be very helpful for your community. We will say that it is also critical that you get a hold of your state senator and state representative. We have this QR code that you can scan right now because there are real risks that we need to address, and we need to protect communities from those risks through public policy. When you scan this QR code, it'll help you send an email to your state senator and state rep that encourages them to stop the subsidies for these giant companies, encourage them to strengthen transparency so that we've got a better understanding of what will impact our local community. And then, of course, an important point is to protect our electric bills from the impacts of these AI data centers. Folks are already having a hard time keeping up with increases in their electric bills without data centers. And we really need to do everything that we can to ensure that the most vulnerable among us are not picking up the tab for some of the largest companies in the world. So please scan it and get a hold of your elected officials for us. We're going to segue into the Q&A here in just a second. So please do use the Q&A function to type your questions. I see that we've got a couple already, which is really wonderful to see. If we cannot get to all of the questions tonight, don't fret. We will follow up with you via email as soon as we can. So just a little bit of a plug for that. Now, do want to mention before we start taking the questions, you can visit our website because we have a lot of different resources about data centers, but also utility issues in Indiana. The other thing that we do want to mention is that staying in the loop with emails and texts from CAC is critical because right now, we're putting the word out to state legislators. We need to protect consumers. But when the session starts in January, we're going to need you to take action again at that point as well. So we try not to bombard you with information, but please do visit our website, sign up to stay in the loop because we'd love to keep you engaged. These fights are marathons, not sprints. And then, of course, we are a nonprofit organization. We're up against utilities. We're also up against big tech. So if you can chip in, that helps us to continue our fight for all of us across the state. And with that, I will stop sharing and we will pivot to the questions. Um, and let us see here. So, Ben, this first question is going to go to you. How would you answer the question, can the grid handle all of these data centers?
Yeah, that's a great question because they use so much power and they consume so much electricity. They're very taxing on the grid. And so when a utility has a new data center customer coming to their service territory, that utility is going to need to plan to acquire additional resources because oftentimes they will not have sufficient generation ready to go for that data center. So that process can take time. It can also mean that if the data center wants that power very quickly, that the utility might have to pay a premium to get that power today to serve that data center. So these are some of the concerns as utilities are building new power plants to meet the speed of the data center needs. If it's doing so in a manner that's not very cost effective for consumers, some of those costs could hit consumer bills. So I think the answer is the grid can handle some data centers, but the scale of the data center proposals we're seeing today are astronomical and completely beyond our ability to meet with our current resources and would require a massive expansion of our power plant capacity, our transmission capacity, yeah. So I think that's important to know. When the data center wants to come somewhere, there's going to need to be some significant planning to make sure that these resources are available, so that doesn't negatively impact other consumers.
Thank you very much, Ben. Kerwin, I'm going to kick this next one to you. We have a question from someone who is generally pro-nuclear, and they're asking if small modular reactors are an effective form of reactors for consumers. Do they mostly work well for industries? Where can we find more information about SMR legislation?
Well, not to be snarky, I guess, but tough question to answer when they're not commercially available or in operation. So we are strongly anti-nuke here at Citizens Action Coalition. We strongly opposed the SMR legislation, most especially because it shifts all of the risk onto consumers. And if utilities, big tech, and these deep-pocketed folks would like to invest in SMRs and bring those to market without putting that on the backs of ratepayers who are already struggling to afford their bills, and also putting it on the back of taxpayers as well, go right ahead. But it's hard for us to answer that question because, quite frankly, SMRs are not currently available. 20 years ago, they were 10 years away. 10 years ago, they were 10 years away. I heard this legislative session that once again, they are 10 years away. So I think big tech certainly has an interest in SMRs. Utilities certainly have an interest in SMRs, but at this point in time, they're not commercially available. And Citizens Action Coalition has a hard time understanding how a technology that is not readily available in the marketplace, number one, can be a solution for our capacity constraints and our energy constraints on the grid. But furthermore, how can something that is not readily available be a tool to address the urgency that is the climate crisis facing us today? We don't have time from our perspective to wait for SMRs to come online if they ever do. We have affordable, clean, readily available technology off the shelf today, including, most importantly, conservation and energy efficiency. That's where we should be directing our resources. And if others would like to continue down the path of trying to bring SMRs to market, CAC says, do your thing, but don't do it on our dime.
Thank you, Kerwin. Ben, you're up next. There was a recent newspaper article, and I think we also saw this in Utility Dive as well. It's about data centers that stated that, there are more than 7 times higher. The amount of data centers proposed are more than 7 times higher than officially reported. Ben's slide mentioned that NIPSCO will see a 30% increase in their carbon dioxide emissions. But can we expand about the data center emissions and how much per project? What knowledge do we have there?
Yeah, I want to say this might be getting at the fact that data centers are maybe underreporting their true emissions associated with their facilities. So I saw a recent article that was saying that their actual impact was maybe 6 or 7 times greater than they were reporting in their public sustainability reports. So for example, data centers might only, or a big tech company might only report on the emissions of the data centers they own, but they might not report the emissions associated with data centers where they're leasing capacity or otherwise are still utilizing, but they're not reporting transparently all of those emissions. So yeah, what we're seeing with our utilities is that the primary way that they are planning to meet the data center load growth is with fossil fuel resources. NIPSCO is one of those utilities. They are planning a massive fossil fuel expansion specifically and exclusively for data centers. They said they did not need to build additional natural gas fired power plants if no data centers are coming to their service territory. But alas, there's a bunch of data centers wanting to locate in Northwest Indiana. And as a result, they want to build out their gas capacity. So a natural gas fired power plant, we have a recent example of Duke Energy proposing one that's pending currently. That is a roughly a 1,400 megawatt natural gas fired power plant. They want to build that Cayuga. And just to give you a sense of the emissions of such a facility, it's over 4 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year that kind of a large natural gas fired power plant would emit. And just that 1,400 megawatt plant could be completely utilized by one data center. So that kind of gives you maybe a scale or a sense of just how significant the emissions impact could be from just one data center that's particularly large. Kelly, do you think I answered that question, or are there components there that you think need further explanation?
That was great, Ben. Thank you, thank you. We got a really good question, and I'm going to take a little stab at this, and then Kerwin, I'm going to call on maybe both of you to fill in the gaps after this, but someone's asking, what is the best way to push back that their representatives are being schmoozed as we speak? Yeah, we know that feeling. I think, we see communities uniting effectively at the local level to sort of stop the request through zoning. And I think one argument that seems very effective is that local officials oftentimes are starved for resources. So one of the big draws for the data center are sometimes the revenue that will be brought into the local community. But folks are really pointing out the risks and the costs that we may be forced to bear. And so balancing that, I think, is important to kind of express to local elected officials. Yes, we need resources, but also think about all of the risks to our utility bills, to our water, that also cost money as well. Kerwin, what do you have to say with that?
What was the specific question? I was listening to your response there, Kelly.
Remember everything, Kerwin. No. What's the best way to push back?
Oh, I mean, no, I think you hit it, but I also think some of the points that Ben raised as well. I mean, an interesting point is the, detrimental impact that it has on future economic development in our community. A data center proposal in a community has a significant impact, not only to what you just spoke of, Kelly, but also the future growth. And what do you want your community to be? Do you want your community to have a big data center and then nothing else for 7 to 10 to 15 years? Or do you want a thriving community that's inviting future investment? So I think that's an excellent point to be raised in the context of pushing back.
And Kelly, if I could chime in with one more point and just add that the strength in numbers, getting organized and having a strong unified pushback at the community level goes a long way to influencing your local elected officials. If they are hearing from hundreds of folks in your community against the data center proposal, they are going to be much more inclined to look at those concerns seriously and potentially not go in favor of the data center, relative to if only one or two people are raising a ruckus. So definitely encourage you to get as many folks involved into their strength in numbers in this type of a fight.
Absolutely. And both of those comments made me think about something that's happening here in Indianapolis, which is a data center proposed for Franklin Township. And folks who are organizing in opposition have been very clear about saying we are not anti-development. We want development that makes sense for us, that makes sense for this plot of land, that makes sense for jobs in our community for years to come. So I think there's sometimes a gut reaction from some to call people NIMBYs and to kind of dismiss arguments as people just don't want anything here. But folks aren't opposed to development. Folks want good jobs, but they also want to have a say in what those jobs are. And sometimes data center proposals advance so quickly that communities feel that their voices aren't being heard. We'll pivot, Ben, back to, the whole diesel generator and backup generation issue, which is another hot topic. What capacity backup generation does a data center typically have on site? Basically, if a data center is 300 megawatts, would they need to have 300 megawatts of backup power or more? And do we just have any general information about studies or emissions about the diesel generators specifically?
Yeah, they do typically have a significant amount of backup capacity. It's not necessarily a one-to-one for their full amount of potential load. It could be a lesser amount. There could be portions of the data center that in an emergency, the data center operator would feel comfortable, not utilizing. But still, there is probably going to be a significant part of their operations that must run 24/7. And so it's going to be a data center by data center case, where each operator is going to make that determination for themselves. But for example, the Amazon data center, we've already seen applications filed for 1,300 megawatts of backup capacity at that data center. And, ultimately we know that facility could have, more than 2,000, more than 2,200 megawatts of load. So there it's not yet a one-to-one, but, it's definitely possible. We see additional applications for more diesel generators there in the future. But it's also possible that Amazon has just decided, what, this is plenty to serve the critical loads, and anything above that, we don't necessarily need to spend the money on having that backup for. In terms of studies, I'm not sure off the top of my head those studies, but I do know, generally speaking, we have a lot of data on the impacts of air pollution, and so I'd imagine diesel generators have been a subject of study out there. I'm not personally familiar with those myself.
Thank you so much, Ben. Kerwin, why are elected officials signing NDAs when their role is to serve their community? And then can we track how much money, if any, are elected officials receiving from big tech?
Excellent question. I know in the MDC meeting on the Google Data Center, Councilor Hart spoke to that. He was criticized for having executed an NDA. He's opposed to the data center in his community. He was criticized for signing an NDA. But I happen to personally agree with his response. And in order to effectively advocate for my constituency and my community, I had to understand the details, and felt it would be a disservice to not execute the NDA, because then you don't have the information, which I happen to agree with, because Citizens Action Coalition, we frequently find ourselves in a position where we have to execute NDAs, and we execute a lot. For better or worse, we execute a lot of NDAs because we cannot, from our perspective, effectively advocate for our members on behalf of our constituency before the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission in cases dealing with an enormous amount of costs that utilities and others want to pass on to customers. In order for us to effectively litigate and make effective arguments, we need that information. And so we need to be informed. So that would be my response. Personally, my personal opinion is, in order to effectively advocate for whoever your constituency may be, you've got to have that information. I certainly though understand the perspective of not signing the NDAs, and I understand the concern over the execution of NDAs. But unfortunately, for better or worse, in the world, in the energy world, in the big business world, the special contract world, NDAs are everywhere. Regulatory bodies like the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission and others quickly deem information confidential. All the utility has to say is this is confidential, market confidential, and the commission will. So that would be my response. In order to really effectively advocate for those you're trying to protect, you've got to have the information in order to effectively argue and push back on those proposals. And as far as campaign contributions, yes, campaign contributions are supposed to be reported. The challenge with data centers, I'm going to stop saying data centers in this context. The challenge with big tech and those that want to build data centers is you're talking about elected officials at every level of government. So you're talking about federal congressmen and federal senators. You're talking about state senators and state representatives, but then it goes even deeper down to the local level. You're talking about county commissioners, city councilors, county councilors, those type of folks. It's much easier to find campaign contribution information on federal and state elected officials, much because there's really centralized databases at that you can go to on the federal level, you can go to on the state level to find that information. But getting down to the granular level at the municipal level or the county level at the election boards or whoever may control that, it's a lot of work. But yes, those folks are supposed to file campaign finance reports and contributions, and that information is readily available. It can just be a little challenging to follow the bouncing ball sometimes with the various places. They've got their hands in all of the cookie jars at every level. And so it can be tough, but yeah, they're supposed to report all that. But I will say, I like to always say, it's not just the campaign contributions that influence elected officials and decision makers. It's the meals, it's the Colts game, it's the Pacer games, it's the symphony or whatever. They're very good at what they do. They know what each elected official and decision maker enjoys, whether it's sports or golf or auto racing or theater or music, whatever the case may be. So it's the attention that the lobbyists and the government affairs folks and the community relation specialists provide. It's the attention that they give folks that make them feel important. And it's also the philanthropy and the contributions to all of the local MPOs and other things and sponsoring this parade and that Little League team. So they're very good at what they do. Campaign contributions, absolutely critical, but there's also other ways in which these deep-pocketed folks influence all levers of government in order to get what they want.
We're here. Okay, Ben, talk a little bit more about GenCo, please. What's the problem with GenCo or problems, and could we make that strategy more appealing?
Yeah, so in the abstract, the goal of protecting existing customers from risks associated with new data centers is admirable and something we support. So at an abstract level, a new model that could fulfill that sounds very attractive. Now, the NIPSCO GenCo model, one of the major issues that we have with it is these issues have not been spelled out in sufficient detail. There is not a lot of information provided by NIPSCO and NIPSCO GenCo about how this entity is going to operate. And that's a problem because this entity could be building potentially billions of dollars worth of power plants without any sort of IURC oversight. They wouldn't have to go through the same certificate of public necessity and convenience, public convenience and necessity that our utilities have to go through, which is a rigorous vetting process. So they're not having that oversight. It would also allow NIPSCO to charge, potentially secret rates to these data center customers by executing special contracts with the data center customers to serve them through this GenCo arrangement. it means us as the public might not have information about those contracts, about those rates, about the assumptions that go into that. And at the end of the day, utilities have also always been telling us that load growth is good because it helps us spread out our costs across more sales. So ideally, a large customer addition should help us lower costs on, for example, residential customers. So another problem with this proposal is where's the benefit to existing customers? If you're getting all this load growth and NIPSCO is going to be getting this windfall, massive increase in profit, why aren't other ratepayers receiving a benefit associated with this newfound wealth? So those are a few of the potential issues. Kerwin, anything else jump out to you as things you would add or maybe correct me on when it comes to the NIPSCO GenCo proposal and some of the concerns that we have with that arrangement in terms of how it's been spelled out so far?
No, I agreed with everything you said. I struggle with it because it's effectively, they want to sort of deregulate the electric market, but only for large load customers, specifically data centers. And furthermore, they want the only competition in their service territory to be themselves, effectively their unregulated affiliate. I mean, what a deal. What a great deal. Deregulate with the only competitor being a completely unregulated affiliate that you own. It's just, it's shady. And as Ben alluded to, lots of NDAs, special contracts, confidential PPAs, and other things that the public will not be privy to, will not be able to look under the hood. So conceptually, sounds like a great idea. And let's build this start this other company to build and own and operate these assets. They'll pay for them. We will shield NIPSCO customers. Nothing to see for except they're going to be NIPSCO customers and billed through NIPSCO rates. But just trust us, wink and a nod. This is a great deal. So really non-transparent, just a little shady. And I'm highly skeptical, obviously, with CAC's position in that case being in opposition.
And one more thing I thought of that I just throw in there, and that is maybe a little bit of a lack of trust too, as a result of the way NIPSCO handled their existing industrial customers. And a few years back, they entered into a settlement agreement with industrial customers that resulted in those industrial customers getting a sweetheart deal, getting much lower rates. And as a result, NIPSCO shifted a lot of those costs of their legacy power plants onto existing ratepayers, onto other ratepayers like residential customers. And that's part of the reason why we have such an affordability crisis up in Northwest Indiana, is a result of that kind of model. So I think there's also, concerns that the way this has occurred in the past has been particularly terrible for residential customers in Northwest Indiana.
Thank you so much, both of you. Folks, we have many, many questions left, and we are not going to get to all of them tonight. So please rest assured that we will follow up with you via email. I do want to take this one last question, I think. And I'm going to broaden it a little bit, but the question is about how we're going to see, or the plan is for utilities to meet the need of these hyperscale data centers with fossil fuels. And some data center companies, big tech, have, expressed commitments to climate goals in the past. Do we think that we'll see more carbon capture and storage in Indiana, some sort of credit system? What kind of, greenwashing will we see as these projects move forward? Ben, I think we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think we're going to see data centers claiming that they're green and sustainable. But then when we actually look at what the resources are that utilities are going to be building and acquiring to serve them and to shore up reliability, it's going to be a lot of fossil fuels. So even if on paper, through various accounting tricks, they're able to claim that we're sustainable, the reality is going to be that the addition of these data centers, if they move forward, it's going to be pretty decimating when it comes to our sustainability in Indiana. So yeah, I think the facilities use an incredible amount of electricity 24/7. And right now what we're seeing in Indiana is a lot of local units of government are banning a lot of or adding restrictive ordinances, preventing clean generation from coming online, like solar and wind, battery storage. And utilities don't need to typically get those approvals for things like fossil fuel power plants. They can use eminent domain, and they can, build those relatively. I mean, no, strike that. So I would just say that at the end of the day, it's important to take these sustainability goals with a grain of salt. These big tech companies, their number one goal is profit, right? And market control. It's their sustainability goals are something that many of them might genuinely believe in or want to achieve, but they're going to come second to the goal of dominating the market and making profit for their shareholders. And so we're already seeing that. We're already seeing a lot of their sustainability goals fall by the wayside as they now pursue artificial intelligence in the massive build out of data centers.
Kerwin, you have anything to chime in before we wrap up this webinar?
Oh, you know me, I could talk for hours on this question, but I guess I would agree with everything Ben said. And, I view CCS in a similar light as SMRs, unproven technology that, good chance it will never become commercially available. And that's the challenge. And that is the struggle with these somewhat bogus, potentially sustainability goals, and also what we see really as the false promise and the false solution that is SMRs and CCS with respect to this conversation. Because what we are seeing today is utilities acquiring or building new gas plants to serve data centers. What we're seeing today is utilities planning to keep coal plants that had previously been scheduled for retirement open. So what we are seeing is the false promise that is SMRs and CCS is going to lead to, the continuation and the increase in the use of fossil fuels to serve data centers, or two technologies that may never become commercially available and cost effective, which poses an extraordinary risk with respect to climate change and sustainability of our planet and our communities. So that would be my response, to just add to what Ben had to say.
Thank you both so much for sharing all this knowledge, and thank you all for being with us for over an hour tonight. Again, we will follow up via email with questions after the webinar concludes as soon as we can. Do want to mention that if you weren't able to type your question into the Q&A function, you hop on our website, sitact.org. You've got our staff email address on there, staff@sitact.org. So please don't hesitate to follow up if you have a question that you weren't able to type into the Q&A function tonight. But we really appreciate all of you joining us this evening. Take good care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.